Polls have shown over and over that the top priority of Americans is not abortion, it is not preserving democracy, it's rising costs and inflation and immigration. But you have this massive gap that is really quite dangerous between elite culture that is completely removed from how the vast majority of the country lives. Now, this is what I find so amazing, is that if you talk to any media person who works in corporate media and ask them what they've most often said negatively about Donald Trump, what they believe most about him, they will tell you that he's racist. That's the thing that offends them the most. He's a white supremacist. In fact, he wants to wage war on Latinos. He wants to come and deport Latinos. Of course, his argument is he wants to deport Latinos who will legally enter the country, not Latino citizens who are legalized here. But the media doesn't make that difference. They think Latinos means illegal immigrants that Trump will come and deport. And yet, no matter how often the media told them, and black voters, and Muslim voters, and Asian voters, that Trump is a white supremacist, they increasingly did not listen and tuned it out. Here's USA Today: shifting loyalties of these voters help power Donald Trump to an election win. Quote, a realignment among Latino voters and a smaller shift among black voters in key swing states helped catapult Donald Trump to his victory over Kamala Harris as the Republican nominee, expanding his support by peeling off voters from two core Democratic constituencies. While Harris spent much of her campaign attacking Trump as a dangerous former president out for revenge and power, polling consistently showed voters preferred Trump over Harris to address their top priority, rising costs and inflation. Now let's just stop there for a second. Obviously, if you are somebody who is in the middle class or the working poor, and you just go and interview people and they will tell you this automatically, what they're most concerned by is their ability to buy the goods they need for their family. There's been massive inflation under the Biden-Harris administration. There's been rising costs in a way that did not exist for Donald Trump. And so when the media is telling them Donald Trump is an authoritarian, Donald Trump is a Hitler-like figure, Donald Trump wants to do away with the regulatory agencies, Donald Trump had a comedian who told a bad joke, any of these things, they don't matter. They matter to people who don't care about rising costs and inflation. The national pundit class in the United States is very wealthy. They go on television, they have big op-ed contracts with major media outlets. They live in upper middle class or upper class neighborhoods in Washington and New York. They live in a way similar to a tiny percentage of people in the United States. How could they possibly understand or identify with the perception that most Americans have? They obviously can't and don't. Polls have shown over and over that the top priority of Americans is not abortion, it is not preserving democracy, it's rising costs and inflation and immigration. It's not Ukraine. It's none of those things that the media focuses on most. It's certainly not the influence of Russia and interference in our democracy. But you have this massive gap, which we've talked about many times before, that is really quite dangerous between elite culture and its members on the one hand, who live increasingly in cloistered and closed systems of information that is completely removed from how the vast majority of the country lives. And that's why when people say, and we're going to show you some examples, I just can't understand how this happened, these people must be stupid and racist, they're being sincere. They don't understand it because they don't have the same concerns as the people who went to the polls. The article goes on, quote, although Trump didn't win a majority of either group, he won support from about 13% of black voters nationally and 45% of Latino voters, according to CNN exit polls. In the 2000 election, in the 2020 election, Trump won just 8% of black voters and 32% of Latinos. In a major shift, Trump won Latino men 54-44 over Harris. He had a 10-point win among Latino men overall nationally over Kamala Harris, according to NBC exit polls. And I should say exit polls can be a little sketchy this soon after the election. They tend to be directionally correct. We should wait a couple weeks until we have like harder core, more definitive numbers. But this is clearly the story based on an analysis of Latino-heavy counties and Trump's increased performance of them. So Trump won Latino men 54 to 44% over Harris, an 11-point win after they backed President Joe Biden 59 to 36 over Trump in 2020. Joe Biden had a 23-point lead over Trump when it came to Hispanic men. Trump not only erased that lead in 2024, but got an 11-point lead himself over Harris, despite running, in large part, on a campaign to deport illegal immigrants, which made so many pundits confused for reasons that we'll show you. Then it went on. Trump won 20% of black male voters against Harris. 1 out of every 5 black men in the United States voted for Donald Trump instead of Kamala Harris. Similar figures that the Republican nominee got in the 2020 election against President Joe Biden. In Pennsylvania, an even greater 24% of black men supported Trump. That's 1 out of every 4 black men in Pennsylvania voting for the Republican candidate against a candidate who's by descent half black and half Indian, which makes it even more amazing that 1 out of every 4 black men in Pennsylvania voted for Trump, while 73% of black men supported Harris, according to a CNN exit poll. That was more than double the amount of black men who supported Trump in the state in 2020. Trump won blue-collar voters who lack college degrees 55 to 42%, while Harris won more affluent voters with college degrees 57 to 40%. In 2020, Trump won voters who lack college degrees by a narrow 50 to 48% over Biden. What you see here is a realignment based on race, but it's really an alignment based on class more than anything else. And this is what the smarter Republicans like J.D. Vance and Josh Hawley have been predicting for a long time, that the future of the Republican Party is a multiracial working class coalition. And you're starting to see that come into effect. And again, since elite media discourse divides people up never by class, only by every other demographic identity, race and gender and sexual orientation, when media outlets talk about diversifying the newsroom, as they always do, they talk about diversifying the newsroom in every way except class. And that's why they cannot comprehend this class realignment based on the perception, the accurate perception, that Democrats have become the party of affluent elites and don't care about the working class at all. And white working class voters originally migrated to Trump, but increasingly Latino and black voters are as well. Here for the New York Times today, early results show a red shift across the U.S. Quote, of the counties with nearly complete results, more than 90% shifted in favor of former President Donald Trump in the 2024 presidential election, according to a Times analysis of election results reported as of early Wednesday. From the Wall Street Journal, this was yesterday as well, how different groups voted in the 2024 election, key shifts in the electorate. And it reads, quote, young voters made up 16% of the electorate and continued their shift toward the right. Think about how amazing that is. Young voters who for decades have been left-wing voters or liberal voters attached to the Democratic Party, specifically when it comes to young men, are rapidly shifting toward the right, away from the Democratic Party. Men ages 18 to 29 voted decisively for Donald Trump. And it actually includes women as well. You have, in 2018, 33% lead, a 33-point lead for women ages 18 to 29. 2020, 32%. 2020 goes down to 21%. And then 2024, 18%. So from just 2018 to 2024, you've had a 15-point shift of young women away from the Democratic Party toward the Republican Party. And then here, men ages 18 to 29 is far more profound. You had a Democratic lead of 19 points in 2018, 15 points in 2020. It was reduced to 1 point in 2024, and then Trump won male voters ages 18 to 29, the Gen X vote, by 14 points. And he got them to the polls. That's an extraordinary shift in how voting typically works. It then goes on, quote, immigration was the second most important issue for voters, increasing to 20% from 3% in 2020. Of those voters who said immigration was the most important, 88% went to Donald Trump. And here you can see this as well, where people who say what is the most important issue, immigration, 23% said it in 2018. It went down to 3% in 2020, only 9% in 2022, and back up to 20% in 2024. And obviously that was a major part of Trump's campaign. He convinced people that that is one of their top issues, and overwhelmingly those people voted for Trump. From the Washington Post, how counties are shifting in the 2024 presidential election. Quote, former President Donald Trump won the presidency after widespread gains across the country delivered him victory over Vice President Kamala Harris. Most of the nation's 3,000 plus counties swung rightward compared with 2020. Think about how extraordinary that is. Most of the nation's 3,000 plus counties swung rightward compared to 2020. The Republican shift appeared across rural border communities in Texas, the wealthy suburbs of Washington, D.C., and even reliably Democratic counties in New York City. Trump widened his margin in rural areas, while Harris underperformed compared with Biden in safely blue cities. This combination and a rightward lurch in major suburbs and mid-sized metro now amounted to a Trump victory in every battleground state where a winner had been projected so far. Now they're using move to the right as shorthand, obviously, for moving away from Democrats to Republicans. I don't really think it has to do with ideological categories of left versus right at all. In some ways, you can argue actually that Kamala Harris ran a more conservative campaign in terms of just being very traditional, very pro-establishment in her advocacy, whereas Trump is kind of all over the place a lot of the times. It really has nothing to do with ideology. It has to do with the perception of which candidate is going to represent status quo interests whom they hate, and that was obviously Kamala Harris, and which candidate they think will be at war with the establishment, and for good reasons, that is Donald Trump. Here's the Washington Post showing exit polls from the 2024 presidential election, specifically how men and women voted. So let's move to the actual charts. Here, again, these are exit polls, so they're likely to change, but not significantly. Among men, Trump won 55% to 42%. And among women, Democrats won 53 to 45%. Now, there was supposedly a huge gender gap where women were favoring Kamala Harris by over 20 points in a lot of these polls. And while there was some gender gap, Trump only lost women voters by 8 points, but he won male voters by 13 points. And you see that same trend repeating itself in the swing states, which is a good reason why Trump won them all. Here is how voters from different age groups voted. And again, 18 to 29, Democrats did get the majority of young voters, 54%, but Trump got 43% of them. The millennials, 30 to 44, Democrats got 1 point more than Trump, so it was basically tied. Gen X of 45 to 64, Trump had a 10-point lead. And then for older voters, it was basically tied as well. Here is by race and ethnicity, and I think this is one of the most interesting and significant changes that is so at odds with the narrative the media has been peddling for so long now, with so much malice, so much toxicity, so much destruction. Here is white voters who make up 71% of all voters. Trump won white voters by 57% to 41%, so a 16% difference. Black voters were 85% for Democrats, 13% for Trump. But again, if you look at black men, that amount was much higher. And then here's Hispanic and Latinos, which make up 12%, a bigger percentage of the voting population than black people for the first time, I think, ever in an election. And the Democrats only won by 6 points with Hispanic and Latino voters. Just an incredible statistic. And then you have other non-white voters here, probably Muslims and Arabs, some of whom were Indians, some of whom Trump won by 12 points. So you just see this kind of explosion of non-white support for Trump. Millions and millions and millions of non-white Americans voted for somebody whom the corporate media has been saying for as long as I can remember is a racist and a white supremacist. Here you see the alignment according to class, which correlates to education. For people with no college degree, Trump won that by 56 to 42%, a 14-point difference. For college graduates, that's reversed by the Democrats, who won by 13 points. So increasingly, the Republican Party is becoming the party of the working class, the Democratic Party becoming the party of the professional, white, affluent class. So for all this talk about this gender gap was much more of a class-based gap. It is true that the Democrats were far more popular among affluent, highly educated women. But for women who are struggling, who live in the working class, who live in the middle class, they migrated to Trump and delivered a 32-point victory, 35% to 63%. Actually, it's from 45, 55, it's a 27-point victory. And so you see this breakdown as being much more about class. Here's the Democrats winning white college graduate women by 16 points. White non-college graduate men, Trump has a gigantic margin, 69 to 29%, and then white college graduate men, Trump even won those by 3 points. This is the realignment in American politics that we are increasingly seeing. It really is on this level of who feels served by and coddled by and embraced by the ruling class and who does not. And that is the strength that Donald Trump has tapped into. That is the populist anger that he has so successfully been able to channel.